Hi, everyone. Welcome to Craft Politics. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
I'm Andrew Percy.
And today we are joined by Hunter Nipton. He's our friend, our colleague. He recently launched the Charting Canada substack, and he's challenging two dominant narratives about the 2025 Canadian federal election. And so Percy and I were supposed to do a cheeky half this week, but I found Hunter's essays pretty interesting. So we're going to punt the cheeky half to next week and get into it. There's two big reasons why I thought we should have Hunter on the show to walk us through his analysis. The first is that ultimately, I think many of us make the mistake of analyzing the election day results, in the first 24, 48 hours after an election, then we kind of like walk away from it. And I think a lot of us have an obligation in our profession to spend a lot of time analyzing the voter map. And so that's the first big reason I wanted to have Hunter on the show. And the second is he has a different take compared to what Percy and I have talked about on the show in the past. In the past, you'd have heard me talk about the success with which the Conservative Party was able to switch over NDP voters in Ontario over to their column, and now that had a significant positive impact on that campaign. Hunter has a slightly different perspective on that, so I thought we should have him on the show to talk about both those things. So Hunter, welcome to Craft Politics.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here.
Let's start with the basics. So there's been this mainstream narrative. Certainly I've been guilty of advancing it, and maybe I still believe I'm right. So maybe we'll gently challenge each other on this. But the myth of the quote unquote NDP conservative switcher is the first thing you tackled with your new substack. Want to walk us through why you think we got it all wrong on this?
Yeah, happy to. And to your previous point about assessing elections afterwards, this is actually the time when you get the best data. When you're heading into elections, people are analyzing public opinion data and making assumptions and models based on a lack of data. Now that we have election results come in, to your point, this is the best time to assess maps and elections and what they mean, because you actually have the results. And so I love playing around with this stuff. And so the first essay that I wrote about, to your point, is I was looking at NDP to CPC vote switchers and actually the lack thereof in my argument. And so the point that I made is that when we're looking at the 17 ridings that the NDP lost, yes, 10 of them did go to the Conservatives and only 7 of them went to the Liberals. So if you just look at that line as a top line, you would assume that a lot of those NDP voters went Conservative. But I dug down into the actual ridings themselves, looking at them one at a time. And I found that writ large, the ridings that went from the NDP to the Conservatives, those ridings were actually, first of all, really close ridings to begin with. In 2021, these 10 ridings that went NDP to Conservative were actually much closer than the 2021 national average. So adjustments at the margins could have had the Conservatives win these ridings. But actually, more importantly, when we look at these 10 ridings that went NDP to Conservative, the drop in NDP support was actually lower than what the NDP experienced in the national average. And even more importantly, the drop in PPC support in these 10 ridings was massive. And so if you take a look at sort of the swings between how many votes the Liberals gained, how many votes the Conservatives gained, how many votes the PPC and the NDP lost in these ridings, just the drop in PPC votes, and one would assume that most of these votes went to the Conservatives, they could have made up more than half of the 2021 margin the Conservatives could have with just PPC voters. And so the other important point is that in these ridings that that flipped from the NDP to the Conservatives, the Liberals actually made really substantial gains as well. And so unless you think that PPC voters and 2025 new voters went to the Liberals writ large, which there's not a ton of evidence for that, then the data just tells us that even in these ridings that flipped from Conservative to NDP, these were really a result of A, the ridings were close to begin with, and B, there were a lot of PPC voters in those ridings that actually went to Conservatives, and that's what caused the ridings to flip to the Conservatives, and the NDP voters in those ridings actually went to the Liberals. But just the fact that there's lots of PPC voters in those ridings and they were close ridings to begin with, that's what flipped those to the Conservatives.
Just for our UK listeners and our American listeners, PPC is the People's Party of Canada. It is sits on the right side of the spectrum. And so that makes a lot of sense, because I suppose at first blush, all we saw was orange ridings have gone blue to Conservative. Ergo, NDP voters have, and we've assumed, I think, because of the nature of some of those ridings, working class NDP voters made the switch to the Conservative Party. And you're saying no, what they did is they picked up what ultimately was a collapse of the PPC vote. I assume Potentially, just because, and I know the data wouldn't necessarily validate this, but that starts to make a little bit of sense. When you think about how Pierre Poilievre was able to build his voter coalition and what made him popular when he became leader of the Conservative Party, he ultimately was able to pull a lot of traction from that side of the anti-establishment type voter. So that starts to make a lot of inherent sense to me. Is there something,
it wasn't just converting those previous PPC voters into Conservative voters. It was also motivating people who normally don't vote. New voters are Conservatives. I was just looking at the North Island Powell River, which was one of the seats in BC that flipped, and conventional wisdom there. I've heard it from Conservatives who were on the ground in that campaign, where we won because the NDP vote came to us. And actually, when you look at that result, the NDP vote held up pretty well. The PPC vote certainly collapsed, but that wasn't enough to explain why the Conservatives went from, I think it was like 20, what was it? I think they went to 31,000 from 21,000 in the election before. So some of that is increased turnout, right? But the NDP vote actually went up in that seat in total numbers, down in percent terms, but up in numbers. So it's actually a lot of people turning out to vote for the first time. Well, maybe not the first time, but certainly for a very long time as well, potentially.
Yeah. Percy, you gave some specific numbers there, and I pulled up the post that I wrote. So I'll give you folks some really specific numbers, and maybe we can dive into it a little bit more. So the NDP to Conservative ridings, those 10 ridings we talked about, the Liberals and the Conservatives picked up almost the exact same number of votes across those 10 ridings on average. So the Conservatives gained 9,200 votes on average, so pretty much that 10,000 votes that you just mentioned, Percy, and the Liberals picked up 7,900, so within just about 1,000 votes of each other. The NDP dropped 4,500 votes in these ridings, so it's actually lower than their national average. So even these 10 ridings that they dropped to the Conservatives, they lost less votes than they did writ large across the country. And the PPC lost 3,000 votes. So the PPC drop was 3,000, the NDP drop was 4,500. And so when you think about that in these 10 ridings, like that's the PPC drop is almost as big as the NDP drop, which you would not think is the case given how much more presence the NDP have federally. And so again, unless you think that these PPC voters went and voted Liberal, the math really doesn't make sense that these NDP votes went Liberal. And then Percy, to your point, there's also a huge increase in new voters in these 10 ridings. So on average, 7,000 new voters voted in 2025 compared to 2021. And that number was 8,100 in these 10 ridings. Pre-election polling, showed that new voters were pretty divided between Liberal and Conservative voters.
Yeah, and just to question that a bit further, but it's also, is it possible that a lot of these people who voted for the first time were people who themselves might have identified themselves though as, oh, I'm an NDP voter, but I'm voting Conservative. So it could be that they weren't NDP voters because they haven't voted for a couple of elections, but they would see themselves as NDP voters. They came out and voted this election. They came out and voted Conservative. So maybe does that in some way perhaps explain the myth? Because I've heard it from so many campaign teams that, people who were on the ground, Conservative MPs, Conservative campaign teams who said to me, oh yeah, we're picking up a lot of NDP voters. And it's possible the two are true. Your analysis could be true, but also these new voters could be people who would see themselves culturally as NDP voters, but just weren't voting.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Like when I talk about new voters, that is just the total number of votes cast per riding. Like the population is bigger than in 2021 and turnout was also higher. On average, there was 7,000 more votes cast per riding that compared to 2021. So yes, to your point, a lot of those folks could have been NDP voters that just didn't vote in 2021. But I guess the facts are that if you voted NDP in 2021, you were extremely unlikely to vote Conservative.
When you walk us through this data, the one way to interpret it, but I'm going to suggest that my way of interpreting is a little bit wrong, so we felt going into and coming out of the federal election campaign that it was a two-party race, a race between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The numbers in so many ways bore that out. The total collapse of the NDP vote bore that out. Yes, there's some nuances different in different parties. Different ridings. The assumption there, when you talk about the fact that the Conservatives were able to successfully poach a lot of PPC voters, particularly in some of these ridings, my first reaction to that would be, okay, well, that makes sense. The left coalesced around the Liberals and the right coalesced around the Conservatives. But then you came out with a second analysis last week in which you analyzed different archetypes. I know Percy hates the term archetype, archetypo, but different segments of the voter population.
It just says it to sound intelligent. I have an English accent to sound intelligent. I don't need to use a fancy word like archetype. just voter group is what he means.
Am I correct? I want to get into each of those archetypes, voter groups, in a
Voter
second.
groups, yeah.
But was I correct in seeing that you saw there actually were some conservative to liberal switchers in some of the analysis, which I think is a part of the story that we haven't heard too much of as well, which is the degree to which and I'm going to suggest they're probably older conservative voters, previously conservative voters in this climate felt Carney was a safer option, and so made the switch. So yes, it seems like we've got two-horse race that remains. It seems to be true a couple months after the results, but it's not as simple as the right has coalesced around the Conservatives and the left has coalesced around the Liberals. At least that's how I'm interpreting things. I want you to react to that.
And I would just add for the listeners that Andrew Percy only puts on the British accent for these podcasts. So if you get to chat with him outside of the podcast, you'll notice his British accent is missing.
I've actually got an accent from Oshawa.
Yeah.
Scarborough.
So these clusters are based on demographic variables only. So this is all from StatsCan. We can't tell how these voters voted in 2021. They're based on the actual ridings that voted for Carney, not necessarily the voters. So these take a look at these 5 clusters that you referenced, put in the data for all 169 ridings that Prime Minister Carney won, and then group them based on characteristics that are similar and different between these groups. And this gives you a sense of the types of ridings that he won to try to explain what types of issues he's going to be pulled left or right on. And so, yes, to your point, there are certainly, just based on the demographics and based on where these ridings are, certainly sort of conservative cohorts within this coalition. There's lots of probably Ford voters in Mark Carney's coalition, particularly in this segment number 2 that I write about in my Substack, and segment number 4 that I write about. So diverse suburbs and commuters. There's lots of ridings along 401, lots of ridings in Brampton, Scarborough, Mississauga that Doug Ford would have won in the recent Ontario election that Mark Carney carried. And so, yes, to your point, lots of these ridings would have a pretty heavily conservative presence. Whether those folks voted for Mark Carney or not is almost beside the point. Like, these are ridings that he's won, and so these are the sort of ridings that are going to have representation in the Liberal caucus, that are going to be advocating for certain issues, and that's really what's going to be driving the decision making.
Just on, because I kind of like, this is where I get a bit confused. It can't be both ways, right? Because I certainly, when I was outdoor knocking, found older conservative voters, particularly white older conservative voters, who were telling me they were going to vote Liberal and they were going to vote for Mark Carney. And they were saying, oh, I'm a conservative. But it was quite, as a British conservative, finding old white people who were saying they were going to vote anything other than conservative was very challenging for me, because I found it, it was, well, not challenging. It was provoked a reaction, because I was like, oh, these, if I was in the UK, this would be the door I'd knock on. I just knew they'd be a nailed on conservative, and I was finding that. But it can't be the case that, the Conservatives are losing a chunk of older voters, as it seemed to be, to the Liberals, but yet we still had this massive increase in the Conservative vote, and we're saying not a lot of that came from the NDP, came from the PPC. It can't all have come from the PPC, plus some new voters, as we've talked about. Is it not that, I love those charts they do after elections where they show all the colours of who went where, because it just seems a bit like, if the Conservatives were losing older voters and only really picking up the PPC, it doesn't explain how we ended up at 40% of the vote.
Yeah, I think, like, in really broad strokes, to make a massive overgeneralization, the way I would sort of describe that chart of where folks went is that the university-educated NDP folks voted for the Liberals. The folks without a university degree that voted PPC went to the Conservatives. And then if you look at the new voters, the folks that didn't vote in 2021, those younger folks voted Conservative en masse, and the older non-voters, which there are less of, because if you're older, you're more likely to tend to be a previous voter. But those sort of 2021 non-voters that are older voted Liberal. Percy, to your point, I think a lot of those folks that didn't vote in 2021 did vote Conservative. Those folks tend to be younger than the folks that didn't vote in 2021 that voted Liberal.
And we might. So it's interesting because I've seen so many pieces written. I was just before we chatted, Googling, and a university professor at the UBC here, commenting about the movement of NDP voters to Conservative. This is as I say, like political parties have talked about this as if it's just a fact. You had the fact that Pierre went around courting union leaders and got the support of particularly private sector union leaders in many places. All of this just seems to feed into this, the narrative, which is just accepted that, yes, there was actually this big movement of work, blue collar working class NDP voters, which is not something, which is also something you've seen. We've seen it in the UK with the rise of Reform and with Boris. We've seen it in the US with Trump. It just seems like this is a natural thing that's happening across the West anyway. So it must therefore be a fact in Canada too.
I would just love for anyone saying that NDP voters went en masse to Conservatives to explain where so Carney just won 1.5 million more votes than a victorious party has ever won. I would just love the explanation as to where those votes came from. If it wasn't from PPC voters, we know that 2021 non-voters were pretty split, with older folks voting Liberal, younger folks voting Conservative. And if those NDP votes went Conservatives, I would love an explanation as to where those tens of millions of votes came from.
Yeah, it's just become an accepted fact, which may not be a fact then.
So in your second piece, you looked at the 160 plus ridings that Prime Minister Carney won. You then came up with, you used a combination of, and I'll let you explain the methodology a little bit better than me, but you applied StatsCan data on top of those ridings combined with the electoral results. That's how you came up with your different voter segments. What surprised you the most when you crunched those numbers about those segments?
I think the degree to which when you sort of think about if there's a coalesce of the left around the Liberals and folks on the right coalescing around the Conservatives, you would think that there's a ton of really progressive ridings that the Liberals represent, and they're therefore going to be pulled to the left. I was shocked to which the extent that there are sort of rural, suburban, sort of immigrant-focused ridings that you would not picture as progressive ridings that Mark Carney now represents. And so I thought that it was sort of going to be a really left-leaning coalition of 169 ridings that Mark Carney is now representing. And I was shocked to which sort of there's, of course, those downtown, like PGC Stewart, University Rosedale, downtown Vancouver ridings, downtown Montreal ridings. Like that is the first segment that I call urban working professionals. But the biggest segment is this segment I call commuters. There's a really big segment called rural Canada that makes up a lot of Atlantic Canada ridings, a lot of northern and eastern Canada ridings. So I was surprised to the extent that there are these sort of center-right ridings that the Liberals won by, I think, pretty narrow margins in a lot of cases that now make up part of the minority coalition that's going to be really tenuous to balance, I think.
This is all really depressing as a Conservative, Hunter. So I'm very annoyed that it's not even 9 a.m. and you've now just completely undone all of my hopes and dreams, in that I just assumed that he would be forced to the left, everybody would abandon him, this will make him the most unpopular Prime Minister in Canadian history, and the next election was all nailed on. So this is all jolly depressing. So just to follow on from that, then, of the new coalitions then, in your analysis, I think many of us have assumed that, as I just said, the Liberal coalition is the weakest, just because it's made up of people who we think, as soon as Carney announces anything to do with the pipeline, a load of voters in these progressive ridings are going to desert the Liberals en masse. But that may not be the case if your analysis is true in terms of what the makeup of these ridings is. So which coalition is, which we inevitably now have of left and right, of the Conservative and the Liberal coalition, which in your view, your analysis is the harder one to hold on to, which has staying power? I
would think the Conservatives would, just because the federal NDP are, of course, a much stronger brand and institution than the federal PPC were. And I think it's important to note, I think listeners might think I'm saying two things at the same time, where my first point is that the NDP went en masse to the Liberals, which would make you think that his coalition is now being pulled to the left. And then in my second Substack, it talks about how there's this one urban worker professionals cohort, and then 4 other segments that tend to be more suburban and rightward leaning. The really important point is that, yes, those NDP voters did go en masse to the Liberals, but when you look at where the NDP lost support, it was really concentrated in sort of downtown cores. And so that's why you saw only 7 seats flip from the NDP to the Liberals, despite them losing most of their voters to the Liberals. The Liberals sort of ran up the score in these downtown ridings, but then won pretty competitive seats in a lot of communities. As I said, in Atlantic Canada, along the 401, northern Canada, seats in Manitoba, particularly around Winnipeg. And so I hope that sort of explains the maybe dichotomy between those two things. But to answer your point, Andrew, I think that the Pierre Poilievre's coalition is probably a little bit less tenuous to balance, for that reason that the PPC vote is probably easier to keep for him than the Prime Minister Carney's NDP vote is to keep. And then also when you just look at the age demographics, like his voting group was younger than the Liberal voting group, which you don't often tend to see. And if he can sort of continue to build that coalition, and as those folks get older, keep those folks in the tent and continue to attract young voters, there may be more growth potential there than with the Liberal coalition.
But I also wonder if there could be a potential realignment here. I mean, so your second analysis, I was really surprised by the fact that, Carney did perform well in suburban and rural ridings. That's a bit counterintuitive. You just assume, you hear the word rural and you just assume it went conservative automatically. You hear suburban and you're like, probably mostly lean conservative. You hear suburban in multicultural, rich communities, you also tend to go, oh, that probably went blue. And it sounds like it wasn't quite obviously that obvious. And so then I start to wonder, well, maybe there's a way, if the NDP is able to get stronger and start to pull back some of the vote it lost, you think about like those downtown urban seats, or hold on to those and add a little bit more. Is it possible for the Liberal Party under Carney to actually strengthen its footing in some rural communities, in some suburban areas? And could that be what a new Liberal coalition looks like in the future? And if so, I worry from a partisan perspective, Percy, that could actually encroach into the Conservative voter coalition map. So it's just a lot to consume here.
You would think that they would have to do that. Like you saw in the Ontario election that happened right before the federal election, the Ontario Liberals were able to run up their popular vote number and get over 30% of the vote across Ontario, but still lost to the NDP by dozens of seats, despite beating them by 7% in the popular vote. And that was largely because they were running up the vote tallies in downtown Toronto ridings. But that is really bad vote efficiency and is not going to win you a number of seats, which is ultimately what we care about in elections. And so if you want to govern and build a coalition, you need to focus less on running up the score in those downtown ridings, downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, downtown Montreal, and really focus on, and this is what Doug Ford has done incredibly well, is find those seats. In Ontario, they're along the 401. In BC, they're in lower mainland BC. There's some around Winnipeg, some around Edmonton, but those are sort of the suburban seats that the Liberals and frankly every party needs to focus on, and if you want to win elections.
Yeah, I am just step back a bit. I'm now confused there as to who is damaged more by the rise of the NDP. So if the NDP do recover, if there is a recovery, given that there's 10 seats flipped NDP to Conservative, was it, I think, and 7, you said Liberal, flipped to the Liberals. It seems then that any recovery of the NDP vote is potentially more of a risk to the Conservatives than it is to the Liberals.
Those 10 seats that flipped from the NDP to the Conservatives, I think that they flipped because of the collapse of the PPC vote in those ridings, and those were close ridings to begin with. I think that those, if the NDP start voting again, not start voting again, but sort of increase, if the NDP are able to increase if they're able to recover, it's going to result in more losses for the Liberals than it will for the Conservatives, assuming that the Conservatives are able to hold that right of center coalition together. Because I've talked about, I just don't think there's much NDP vote in that Conservative coalition. And if the NDP vote spikes back up, it's going to fracture the vote on the left and not have a huge dent on the Conservative vote.
Right. You're saying then if there had been clear evidence that there were a lot of NDP voters in particularly important ridings, swing ridings, had switched over to Conservative, then that would be a tenable, it'd be a fragile collection of votes that the Conservatives are holding on to, and therefore they'd be at risk at losing them, and then things would flip. But it's not. You're saying because that switch didn't occur, the base upon which the Conservatives are operating is a much more resilient voter base.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like those 10 ridings that went NDP to Conservative, I agree they were held by the NDP, and I agree they were won by the Conservatives. My point is that they were close ridings to begin with, and the Conservatives picked up PPC vote. Even if the NDP didn't drop vote, the Conservatives probably would have ended up winning those ridings just with the increase in new voters and PPC voters. And so they didn't really benefit all that much from the NDP dropping. I think if you kept the NDP vote consistent in those ridings, the Conservatives still would have won most, if not all of them.
Just to follow this through, though, because the whole part of the Conservative strategy was to cozy up to unions, particularly private sector unions. We had the strike here in Vancouver at the port, in which there were Conservatives chomping at the bit to go out after it. Pierre sat on them. They were told to keep quiet. So, this has not been done by accident. You would assume then that, there has been data and polling where the Conservatives have done, which has informed that strategy. So I suppose it then makes me think, well, if this shift didn't occur and we have the data now to inform us on that, is the strategy now of the Conservatives going to be one that has to be rethought? Because is the next voter group to get you to the majority that you want to get at the next election, is it not the blue-collar NDP voting working class guy with a truck? Is it actually some of these older, moderately conservative voters who were put off that probably stopped the Conservatives winning seats like Richmond East, Steve Stern, probably stopped winning Port Moody, Coquitlam, all of these seats in the kind of, suburban areas of big cities? Is that where the focus should be then? Which is their complete flip on where, and does that also then raise the question of, well, is Pierre the best person to go after that? Because he was very much seen as the best guy to go after the kind of blue collar, white working class truck driver, but not maybe, Ethel and George, who are living in the suburbs of Vancouver.
I do think there's a really important point here that the truck driver, blue collar truck driver you just discussed, they were going to vote for Pierre when Trudeau was still the leader of the Liberals. They just couldn't bring home, to use the slogan, they just couldn't bring home that vote. I would say largely because when you think about the folks that are most exposed to a Trump presidency and tariffs and steel tariffs and all these sorts of things, these typical blue collar union workers are probably the folks that are most terrified of a Trump presidency and the economic turmoil that he would bring. And then when voters saw Prime Minister Carney as by far and away the best person to deal with Donald Trump, these left of center blue collar union workers, they voted for Prime Minister Carney because of the whole Trump issue. But I think those folks were planning on voting for Mr. Poilievre even after Prime Minister Mark Carney became the leader of the Liberals. But as soon as they saw Prime Minister Carney as the best person to protect their jobs against Trump, they voted for Prime Minister Carney. But I do think that they were part of Poilievre's voter coalition at a point during the campaign, and so it doesn't seem out of the question that they could vote for him again.
I still had
Sorry, go ahead, Percy.
Just have to push on this though, because I still had it right up until election day. Conservative MPs I know when I was home said it's really strange. One time, this was an Ontario MP who said to me I was out in the street the other day and this guy in a truck came driving up to me and said, hey, I'm voting for you guys for the first time. Same thing happened to me when we were out in Richmond, actually. Guy in a big truck pulls up and said, what are you guys doing? I said, we're here for the Conservatives. Like, good. He said, if you were for anybody else, I would have said this. So there are all these anecdotal stories coming back. And at the same time, the same people were saying, but when I knock on an old person's door, it's quite unpleasant. So it just seems really hard, maybe because we've just been told it so much that I just kind of struggle to believe that the truck driving guy with the organ, whatever, and listening to country music didn't go out and vote for Pierre, because it just seemed that that's what we were hearing.
I really think that a lot of this comes down to the underappreciation for how many PPC voters there were in 2021 and just how big the drop was. Like, they are not ever included in, or not ever, but they're rarely included in public opinion polling, at least public facing. And so people don't really have an appreciation for them. But if you look at their vote drop, and I'll pull up my substack again. In these votes, in the ridings that flip from NDP to Conservative, the PPC dropped 3,000 votes per riding. The NDP dropped 4,500. And so if you think about just how concentrated the PPC vote was, like, they pretty much every riding they performed okay in 2021, they went to almost zero in this election. And so I think that a lot of those folks, people just saw them on the street. They were a blue collar person that belonged to a union, driving a truck. Percy, to get all of your anecdotes in there.
I think a lot of those people. There was a dog in the truck.
Maybe I had to believe every country music listener is a conservative.
Voter, maybe folks just assume that they were NDP voters and they were PPC voters. Like, people just, for whatever reason, don't think that there are PPC voters out there. But in 2021. Like, I'll get the number, but there was more than 1 million voters across Canada that voted PPC.
But there's something about, this entire analysis and story, I think that I think remains true, which my gut instinct throughout the campaign and coming out of it was that the ballot question was so damn clear in this campaign. And the Trump factor plus Trudeau being out of the equation just changed the alignment for a lot of people. And it gave people permission to think about voting Liberal again. And it gave permission for older Conservatives to consider making the switch. It maybe allowed some previous NDP switchers to consider making the switch as well. Like I think there was the moment, it was no longer about what your typical party alignment is and how you felt coming out of COVID on anti-establishment stuff. It was who's the right person right now to deal with this crisis. And I think it seems that remains a core consideration that a lot of voters had. So I like to think that means our analysis during the election campaign, Percy, wasn't completely wrong.
No, I think it was, well, look, we'll just delete everything we put out if it was wrong.
Yeah.
We'll use AI to restructure what we said.
Hunters, listeners, if they want to go explore this in a little bit more detail, because we just scratched the surface of what you analyze, where can they find your work?
Yeah, the Substack is called Charting Canada, so chartingcanada.substack.com.
And can you give us a sneak peek? What's coming down the pipeline? Any other interesting theories you're going to be testing for us?
Yeah, I think the next one will try to figure out if this two-party system will hold or not in Canada, and I'm going to primarily look at education as a sort of driver of vote. My working theory is that, as I discussed on this podcast, that if you were not a Conservative or Liberal voter in 2021 and you voted for one of those two parties in 2025, if you had a university degree, you voted Liberal, and if you didn't, you voted Conservative, to massively oversimplify it. And so I'm going to be looking at that and seeing if that tells us, if that indicates whether or not we're going to continue with this sort of two-party race that we saw in 2025.
I have 2 points on that I just wanted to add. But first of all, I just want to just confirm that you don't just look at what Joseph and I have said and then set out to deliberately find things to disprove it. Is that what motivates your life? I just want to be clear on this. That, I mean, if it is, it's kind of sweet that you're that obsessed. But I just want to be absolutely clear that,
No, it's how I start my
start your day. And
exactly.
It's not me, it's Joseph you want to disprove. I get that. He's not a likable character. He's a bit smug, and therefore you want to disprove him. But on the two-party thing, I just final reflection from me was I always remember after the 2017 UK general election where this same thing happened, where you had both of the major parties between them got over I think 90% of the votes, the highest percent the two parties had, or close to 90% anyway, had in a generation, and everybody said, oh look, we've got this new two blocks now, and it didn't even last to the next election, right? The left-wing block of it disintegrated by the next election. The right-wing block disintegrated by this 2024 election. So, I'd be interested to see whether this does hold here in the same way, because one thing we do know about voters, right, is that they are less party prone than ever before. So, but I look forward to reading that analysis, and I'm just going to agree with it from now on.
Well, yeah, as somebody who writes a Substack on data, one election is not a sufficient data point to make a conclusion on. So I tend to agree with you that this is more likely an aberration than a trend, but we will see.
Well, yeah. Awesome, Hunter. This is great. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, lads.
Really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.